and after going through the module, you will know about the labor market, understand the labor market in India, and analyze the role of state intervention in labor market. Beginning with labor market and its functioning. The demand for labor is a derived demand. That is, the demand for labor is not a direct demand, unlike the commodity demand. A labor is demanded only when a demand for commodity is there. As against commodity market, labor market has personal factors playing an important role, which are governed by the socio-economic and cultural interplay within the society. As just now said, labor is essentially an imperfect market because the buyer of the labor normally sets the price. Labor market undergoes a process in which it balances the supply and demand for a particular factor in abstraction. There are certain indicators of labor market. That means a labor market in any country can be studied on the basis of these indicators. The first is labor force, that is, that part of population which is ready to provide its labor. The second is participation rate. The participation rate can be calculated by dividing the labor force from the total population. The unemployment level is there and unemployment rate is there. The rate of unemployment means that the number of unemployed persons who are a part of labor force, and thus is calculated by dividing the number of unemployed persons from labor force. Employment rate is another indicator of labor market. Employment rate can be calculated by dividing the number of employed persons from total population. Labor market is governed by certain institutions. These institutions are the rules, practices, and policies that are related to labor market and its participants. The rules in labor market can be formal or informal, that is, are written or unwritten, or are followed by conventions and customs of the society. These rules can be universal or particular depending upon the location or region. Further, these institutions, they show us the systems, dynamics, and structure within labor markets and their constituents. These institutions reflect the different level of society's norms, values, cultures, and legal policies. That is, the interaction between the buyer of labor services and the provider of labor services. The labor market institutions are the cooperation governing the behavior of constituents, and the constituents of labor markets are the workers, the employees, the government, and the policy makers. Further, these institutions can be studied through the employment protection legislation. That is, the government of a state protects its employees through various legislations, and they form a part of labor market institutions. Collective bargaining is yet another institution. Wage determination policy, in which the government in a state-run society or the buyer of labor services in a privately owned institution decides the prices. Then, what are the institutions available that train and skill the labor? It also includes social security and income guarantee schemes. The income guarantee scheme can be the minimum wage as has been prescribed by the government from time to time, the unemployment benefit which government provides to those who are unable to get an employment in the market. Then under social security schemes, there are non-discrimination policies, non-discrimination on the basis of class, caste, creed, gender, and there are regulations for women and disabled employees. Further, there are certain national labor laws, and post-globalization, these institutions are also governed by international labor standards. In a developing country, labor markets are generally marked by dual labor markets. That is, there are formal labor markets and there are informal labor markets. So all those institutions and offices where a worker is working on a permanent salary or wage, they are formal markets, and informal markets are, there is an oral contract between the employment provider and the labor. The large share of labor in developing countries tend to be in the agriculture sector and rural sector. Other than these two categories, there are non-wage labor also. That is, all those people who are self-employed and secondly are working in the family business and are unpaid for that reason. In developing countries, there is a higher labor force growth. There are low human capital investments. That is, to enhance the skill of labor, there are less quantity of investment. Now coming to labor market imperfections. As has been told in the beginning, the labor market is the most imperfect market. This market can be flexible or rigid. Rigidity in the labor market creates market failure. Due to strong employment protection measures and other social policies, protecting workers create difficulty for the employers to deal in highly competitive markets. However, there is no strong relationship or any statistical data that proves that the linkage between employment protection measures and high unemployment rates are there in the market. Labor market policies like minimum wages, job security regulations, and social security are usually intended to raise welfare and reduce exploitation. But they actually work to raise the cost of labor in the formal sector and reduce labor demand, which further increases the supply of labor to the rural, urban, informal sectors and thus depress labor incomes where most of the poor are found. The excessive strict employment protection measure is one of the important contributor to persistently higher and long duration unemployment experienced in many developing countries since early 1980s. The reduced scope for flexibility for gaining competitive edge in the market, the increased costs to employers make difficult the dismissal of workers and make industries hesitate to hire new workers. Hence, less incentive is there for job creation. According to OECD, such relations has not been found. According to OECD, there is only a weak evidence for the negative impacts of labor market regulations. Moreover, labor laws and labor market policies are needed to ensure social justice for workers of developing countries. In labor markets where labor is in surplus, there must be a minimum statutory protection for workers. As I've just now said, that labor market can be rigid or flexible. For flexibility in the labor market, the key issues for employees, management, and social partners and policymakers alike is to strike the right balance between flexibility and security. There are certain flexicurity points that should be adopted. Flexicurity means flexibility and security together. The first point is flexible and reliable contractual agreements through the modern labor laws, collective arrangements with worker organizations should be made. Secondly, compressive lifelong learning, that is continual training, opportunity for adaptability and employability of workers, and especially for the most vulnerable workers. Effective active labor market policies are also required, which helps people to cope with rapid changes and reduce the unemployment duration and ease difficulty of transition to new jobs. The modern social security schemes that provides adequate income support, encourages employment, and facilitates labor market mobility and broad coverage of social protection should also be undertaken. The labor can be exploited needs reforms and regulations. The labor policy, which has been undergone the neoliberal reformation in the 1980s and 1990s, did not produce big success in improving employment or other type of performance in labor markets. This shows that flexible labor market institutions are not the panacea for labor market problems. Now coming to labor markets in India, the most common hypothesis about Indian labor market is that it is outdated and invalid. The differences between Indian labor market and labor markets in developed countries are not of essence, but of degree. The Indian labor market is believed to be exceptionally imperfect. Actually, labor markets everywhere are more or less imperfect because of the peculiarities of labor, that the degree of imperfection should be rather more in a large underdeveloped countries with pronounced socio-cultural differences between different regions is to be expected. On the other hand, the historical tendency for geographical wage differentials to narrow and the evidence of gradual breaking of the barriers to geographical mobility suggests evolution of national labor markets. Similarly, the view that industrial labor, being mainly migrant, is not stable and does not have a high degree of commitment is not based on any evidence. The extent of instability has been very much exaggerated. Further, instability is at least partly the result of employers' policies of constantly changing the workforce so as to keep down wage bills. The existence of a single competitive national labor market is indeed difficult to conceive in a vast country like India. The simultaneous persistence of labor surplus as well as labor deficit areas in the country indicates that markets are more local and regional than national. To speak even of local or regional labor markets of all industries in a competitive sense may again not be theoretically acceptable on account of the mechanized and specialized techniques of production. But for a large part of labor supply and demand, mainly for unskilled and semi-skilled types, it may, however, safe to talk about the local and regional markets. The existence of wide geographical wage differentials in the same industry, inexplicable in terms of productivity differentials, suggest the absence of a labor market wider than local and regional, even for a single industry. On the other hand, relatively smaller inter-firm and inter-industry wage differentials at the local and regional level suggest the existence of local and regional labor markets with fair degree of competition. Historically, narrowing tendency of geographical wage differentials and evidence of losing holds of the barriers of geographical mobility clearly suggests the existence of a process of evolution of national labor market. Lack of mobility is the source of imperfections in the labor market, and the assertions denying the operation of market mechanism in case of labor are based on the alleged lack of mobility of labor in India. In India, the labor force can be divided into four categories. First, self-employed workers. Second, wage and salary earners. Third, casual workers. And fourth, unemployed workers. Of these, self-employed are most loosely connected to labor markets because of the possibilities of work sharing and work spreading in a self-employed enterprise. Non-contractual casual laborers have the closest connection to labor market on almost day-to-day basis. Same is the case with those unemployed who are actively seeking work. Contractual and hence stable hired employment with the same employer in the same job on a regular basis is covered in the description of wage and salary workers. Persons who are engaged in their own farm or non-farm enterprises are defined as self-employed. The employees in an enterprise can be either regular, salaried or wage employees, or casual wage employees who are normally engaged on a day-to-day basis. The casual wage workers, both in public work and other types of work, do not have any job security or social security. These workers, either in formal or informal sector or in a private household, are called informal workers. The regular salaried or wage employees are those working in other farms and non-farm enterprises and getting in return salary or wages on a regular basis and not on the basis of daily or periodic renewal of work contract. This category includes those getting time wage as well as those receiving piece wage, all salary and paid apprentices, both full-time and part-time. This category of persons may therefore include persons engaged regularly on an hourly basis, temporary workouts, outworkers, etc. Now, coming to the state intervention in labor markets in India. State intervention is needed in labor market because it is an imperfect market. So, historically, state intervention into labor policies in India is directed towards ensuring both job security and income security. The laws are found to serve the organized workers primarily, while large masses of unorganized workers are without any security. To escape legislations, employers have substituted labor by capital, hired casual workers, and set up ancillary units. Consequently, output elasticity of employment has consistently declined, and there is marked actualization of workforce. Legislations have thus institutionalized and perpetuated labor market dualism. Reforms herein are necessary but should be implemented in a careful and phased manner to avoid deteriorating conditions in both the sectors in the name of uniformity. Linking retrenchment with area regeneration programs, upgrading employability quotient through training, allowing employers to transfer workers between units, providing and allowing employers to transfer workers between units, and providing easy credit and technical consultancy, cooperative formation would help the workers. Interaction between state and labor historically came into being as work became organized and some sort of regimentation of workforce was started. Laws and acts concerning labor originated to ensure regular and disciplined workforce to the modern sectors of production, that were mines, plantations, and factories. This was done to ensure that wavering commitment of workers migrating from traditional agricultural sector to these sectors does not create recurring shortage of labor and irregular production. There have been two basic tenets of labor policies in India related to the fields of A, employment securities, and B, minimum wages and other benefits. After independence, labor laws were enacted to eradicate labor exploitation and to shift the balance of power from the employers to the workers. The other objective was to enhance the welfare of the workers in general so that they can live with dignity. This was expected to spread prosperity to a larger mass of people in the long run. Employment security was provided through regulations and state interventions, and the market forces were substituted by forcing employers to ensure certain minimum standard. State intervention in determining wages has also been quite substantial in India and quite pervasive in organized sectors. The only area where labor laws, both regarding job security and adequate income, have been implemented with some fervor in India has been that of organized industries and public sector. Wages here have been fixed to ensure certain living standards. Revisions to wages have been fairly regular. Full indexation have been used in the intermediate periods. Annual increments have been systematic, and bonus and other welfare payments have been consistent. The objectives of state intervention in labor market have not been fulfilled in India. Why? It has often been argued that such interventions have achieved employment at the cost of employability. Legislations based on job type and working conditions criteria have institutionalized, propagated, consolidated, and perpetuated dualism in labor market. The assumption that slowly more and more workers will enter the formal sector where the model legislations are operative has not come true. On the contrary, employment have increased in the form of informal jobs where employers are not encumbered by rules related to security of jobs and minimum wages, and therefore can exploit the workers. The very intention of providing protection to the working class has created a small enclave of protected laborers, leaving out the teeming millions to fend for them in the market. This has gone against the proclaimed principle of social equity, leading to persistence of poverty and economic inequality. It is argued that in the context of globalization, labor market reforms are necessary for stimulating long-term growth of output and employment in the Indian economy. The attack has mainly been focused against the regulations restricting retrenchment and closure, that is, those that impede employment flexibility. While it is true that restrictions to flexibility have prevented unemployment during downturns, it has also dampened employers' incentive to expand employment during upswings. These regulations have obstructed expansion of flourishing sectors, prevented restructuring of dying sectors, and hence constrained growth in both output and employment. Also, high actual labor costs act as a restraint to foreign investment and confines it to capital-intensive sectors. In the face of growing external competition, the clamor for restructuring the gained momentum, these regulations have obstructed expansion of flourishing industries, prevented restructuring of dying sectors, and hence constrained growth in both output and employment. Also, high actual labor costs act as a restraint to foreign investment and confines it to capital-intensive sectors. In the face of growing external competition, the clamor for restructuring has gained momentum. It is argued that if introduced, the right to hire and fire will enable employers to compete with MNCs enjoying flexible conditions and help them to actually prosper, lifting employment figures upwards. Summarily, labor, unlike other factors of production, is governed by socio-cultural conditions. The labor markets, which, as has been repeatedly said, are imperfect because of wage and productivity differentials, need state intervention to accomplish the objective of social justice. The contradiction, however, is that the stringent intervention by state dampen the spirit of employers who want flexibility in providing employment. This has resulted in casualization of workforce on a large scale. Also, it has increased the number of working poor.